Hi, I'm going to give my paper presentation on child soldier use and its deterrence. Um, the issue of child soldiers is a two-pronged thing. One is on the front end, the preventing the recruitment of children as soldiers, and then on the back end is once they've been released from being soldiers, how do you reincorporate them back into society? I chose to focus on the recruitment in my paper because even though both of them are considered child soldier issues, the recruitment and the reintegration I felt like were really separate issues, and I noticed that they were dealt with differently by international organizations, but there's a bit of overlap. A little bit of history. In 1924, the League of Nations signed the Geneva Declaration on the Rights of the Child. This did not address child soldiers at all. They, but it did forbid the exploitation of children, and it was an important document for international organizations going forward. In terms of the rights of children in armed conflict. In 1959, the UN adopted the Declaration of the Rights of the Child, their own version of it, which is an expanded version of the League of Nations Declaration on the Rights of the Child. And in 1989, the UN held the Convention on the Rights of the Child and created the Committee for the Rights of the Child, which are both called the CRC. So have fun with that. And in 1996, Graça Machel was commissioned by the UN to write a report, and he delivered this report to. Actually, I shouldn't say he. I don't know what gender Graça Machel is. Graça Machel delivered this report, Impact on Children of Armed Conflict, in 1996, and it had a big impact, and it led to the formation of a group of NGOs who felt that the UN was going too slow in addressing the child soldier issue. And this coalition was called the Coalition to Stop the Use of Child Soldiers. And it was made up of 6 NGOs, including Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. So in 2002, the UN passed the optional protocols to the Convention of the Rights of the Child. And optional protocol 1 was specifically about recruiting child soldiers, and don't do it. It defined child soldiers as anyone under 15 years old, but it encouraged states to employ soldiers whenever possible over 18 years old. And this became a problem in the international organization dealing with child soldiers because a lot of child soldiers are being employed not by states but by non-state actors. And so later international law that applies to non-state actors or non-state armed groups forbids them to use as a soldier anyone under the age of 18, whereas unless states have also signed these measures, which a lot haven't, states are allowed to use children who are as young as 15. In fact, the United States didn't want to sign anything that wouldn't let them use soldiers that were 17 years old. And Britain, the UK, wanted to be able to use soldiers that are 16 years old. But these non-state armed groups are still subject to the 18-year-old definition of child soldiers. So they have to play by different rules. And getting these non-state armed groups to enter into discussions with the UN, like with UNICEF, has dealt with a lot of child soldier issues or instances because they deal with children and they are present in a lot of conflict zones, and um, they, you know, for the UN in general, trying to establish relations with non-state armed groups is difficult. Um, and the perception of non-state armed groups that they're being treated differently according to international law, it makes it more difficult. Not to mention also that states give permission for the UN to talk to non-state armed groups, which means that it can potentially give the non-state armed group legitimacy by allowing the UN to talk to them. So sometimes states don't allow that, and which means that dealing with the issue of the use of children as soldiers by these groups is up to NGOs, who, as we know from class, are generally perceived as being more independent. That's one of their characteristics, and impartial, which appeals to these non-state armed groups, NSAGs. So, one way of looking at the issue is from the perspective of organizational growth. International organizations have had to learn this kind of stuff that I've been talking about, the hurdles of treating non-state armed groups, and how they're included or not included in international law, and in what way they're included. Are they treated differently or the same? How can they be contacted and dealt with? So the UN and NGOs have tried a lot of different stuff to try and deter child soldier recruitment, like getting involved in communities and working with local police. And this has been an example of organizational growth, of organizations learning and adapting. So another way of looking at the child soldier issue is from social constructivist perspective, and that really has to do with the norms about why should we not use children as soldiers. Well, that's an international norm, but it's not necessarily as international as one might think. In some parts of the world, a child is considered someone under 14, and employing a soldier at the age of 15 would seem totally normal and correct. And so the social constructivists' take on the issue would be that the ideas of who should be a soldier and who shouldn't, and how to deal with that issue, are developed around norms and beliefs, and they change, and they according to new information, and there has been a lot of new information gathered about child soldiers in the last 20, 30 years, a lot more than there used to be. And another way of looking at the issue is a Marxist theory. Child soldiers are cheap, and for a state in the developing world, to employ child soldiers may be necessary if they're going to fight a war. And that's something that the developing world doesn't have to deal with. So And a non-state armed group uh, is maybe fighting a capitalist system of exploitation, and they find that the local population has young people, young men usually, uh, who want to join and fight. And those young men might be under 18 or under 15 even. And these non-state armed groups that are fighting the capitalist hegemony, are sort of hogtied in what they're able to do. And it can be argued that international law forbidding child soldiers is uh, an instance of uh, capitalist power trying to impose uh, limits on the possibility of revolutionary change. Um, so this was my fifth take of this video. Previous ones had various problems in sending and recording, and I think this one actually made it. So sorry I couldn't be there, but also not sorry because I'm somewhere warmer. Okay, sorry.